We've been spending some time in previous lectures discussing Enrique Dussel's book, Philosophy of Liberation, and we've spent a lot of time in the first and second chapters. There's a lot of good tools for our analytic efforts to try to understand ourselves and our situation and possible need for liberation. But we've run out of time for the semester, and so I need to wrap it up for this term anyway, and try to summarize some remaining issues and thoughts of Dussel and try to pull that together in a final lecture here that we can entitle Becoming a Philosopher of Liberation. So if you take a look on page 178 of Philosophy of Liberation, section 5.9.5.1, Dussel discusses what it might take to be a philosopher of liberation, and it's difficult to say. He says, ultimately, it's to think everything in the provocative word of the people. And what does that mean? Well, fundamentally, it's a pedagogical activity to be a philosopher of liberation, pedagogical in the sense of teaching. It's rooted in a praxis, he says, of teacher-pupil or thinker-people proximity, not proxemics, not just coming close in order to use, to buy and to sell, but that fundamental metaphysical proximity from which we all spring, that Dussel says is both our origin and our goal. The essence of philosophy of liberation, he says, is theoretical and speculative. Speculative or theoretical in the sense of seeing, theoria in Greek, to see, and speculative in the sense of reflection. A speculum is a mirror, so to reflect upon who we are and what our situation is. The goal, he says, at the risk even of the life of the philosopher, to discover and expose injustice. That idea of ethics and politics as first philosophy for thinkers like Dussel and Correa. Philosophy of liberation functions in the name of the poor and oppressed, and it shoulders, he says, an infinite responsibility, an ethical responsibility, not just a moral conscience, which is configured by the totality, as we've been talking about, but an ethical conscience that is open to and listens for the excluded, the marginalized, the exterior. And he says, in the end, it takes the most thoroughgoing critical consciousness possible. And we'll see as this talk progresses exactly what he means by that. But again, to be a philosopher of liberation requires that you become who you are. He's just following up on the Socratic dictum to know yourself. And that's a dialectical process. Knowing yourself requires knowing your situation, requires knowing your historical reality, to be immersed in that concrete reality in which yourself is not only found, but configured. Reality, as we learned from Zubiri, is ultimate. There's no escaping it. It's possibilitating. Our reality is that which provides us with all the possibilities that we have. And reality is impelling in the sense of making demands upon us, pushing us to choose and to act and to make ourselves. So you have not only to know yourself, but the only way to know yourself is in making yourself, as Zubiri would say, as agent, actor, and author, as the one who does, but the one who does in a variety of roles, but one who inhabits those roles with the possibility of editing those roles and changing those roles and finding new possibilities in those roles as author. And you have to make yourself with others, other persons, other things, other institutions, other technologies, and so forth. So we know ourselves only by making ourselves, and we can only make ourselves with others. So who are you? Well, Correa says that there's a multi-level answer to that question. He says, first, you should think of yourself rightly as an empirical subject, what he calls an empirical subject. And what he means by empirical subject is you, as opposed to anyone else ever, what Caputo would call a singularity, right? The one and only you. That's your empirical self. But there's also the historical subject, and that's you, still you, but as configured by concrete social relationships, power structures, the economy, political arrangements, and technological constructions. The you that you are, the you that I am, is configured, a constructed I. It's constructed by our own actions as agent, actor, and author, but it gets constructed for us by the social, political, economic structures in which we find ourselves. So the historical subject that you are would include the fact, for instance, that you're a student at a particular university, in a particular city, in a particular country, at a particular time in history, among many other things. And then he says there's the possibility of you as a philosophical subject, a you converted, as he says, to critical thinking. And that, he says, is to be on the way to being what he calls an organic philosopher. What does he mean by organic philosopher? A critical thinker thinking from the place of the people, from a metaphysical position, if possible, we talked about that, thinking as an organ of the well-being of the people. All right, that's where he thinks real philosophy happens, just like Eukria says, and that is a possibility. That can be you as well. So you're an empirical subject, which is a fundamental, a bottom line, a you and nobody else. But you, whoever you are, is always shaped, configured by your situation, by your circumstances, by your context, by your horizon. That's inescapable. And the philosophical subject that you might be converted to, would be one who can recognize where you as a historical subject and where we as historical subjects come from, and who benefits from our being configured and constructed as we have been. So there are a variety of ways of thinking about who you are that I think would be consonant with philosophy of liberation. From a dialectical point of view, you could think of yourself, as we said a moment ago, as a configured configurer. Yes, agent, actor, and author, configuring, but also configured by the situation, by the roles you inhabit, by the traditions that have been passed over onto you, the set of possibilities and capacities with which you're equipped. So a configured configurer. In interplay, as you continue to configure yourself, the situation changes. As the situation changes, you get reshaped and reformed as well in an ongoing process. From a theological perspective, we could think of ourselves as created co-creators, right? We're created by God on a theological point of view, but we're created to create, to create along with the creation in which we find ourselves. Again, in that interplay, that inescapable interplay. And you could think from a theologal point of view, from Zubiri's point of view, that you are a relative absolute, a relative absolute. You are an absolute in the sense that you can step away from all of those labels and all of those horizons to a certain extent, in a certain sense, but you had no choice about that. That is the you that you are. You're not an absolutely absolute like a God, but we are kind of sort of absolute in a relative way. And Zubiri takes that in a very theologal direction by saying that we are the experience of God. Not just we are experiencing some other being called God, because that God would not be considered a being for Zubiri, but a reality. Reality, the reality. And we're real, so we are God's experience. And we can experience ourselves as God's experience. So you got to hear that interplay at all times of shaping and being shaped and reshaped, always ongoing. Now, I'm going to put up a rather busy graphic that Dussel provides for us on page 184 of Philosophy of Liberation. There's a lot going on here, and it's going to take me a minute or two to try to talk through this with you. So I've annotated this, so I've made it even busier than Dussel did. But I'm hoping that maybe with my notes we can kind of think through what he's trying to tell us here. You'll notice in the middle bottom of the slides the abbreviations that he uses, and those are represented in the graphic up above them. But let's start in the upper left-hand side. You see ES. That is the empirical subject. That's you, the one and only you, the singularity, as Caputo would say. That's you. So we're talking about you. Reality is you, not some abstraction, but concretely, singularly, unrepeatably, uniquely you. Okay. But just below that, you see HS. That's that historical subject that is also you. It's you as you have been configured and have done your configuring in the social relationships, power structures, economy, political situation, and so forth. That's you. That's sort of the starting point. And then he says it is possible, as you can see in the green on the left-hand side here, a conversion to critical thinking. Now, what might spark that conversion? That's the same question that we asked at the beginning of the semester about the escaped prisoner in Plato's cave. What happened? What got the prisoner to stand up? What broke the prisoner's chains that they've been in all of their life? What happened? And we speculated about how that might happen. Well, it could happen. Something could happen. Something could break through the chains, the bonds that are holding us in the status quo according to the reigning ideology. Something could. Maybe it's what Dussel would refer to as some kind of epiphany, something that breaks through the normal and the normalized. And that could possibly convert you to a philosophical subject, you as a philosopher. Now, not a philosopher in the abstract, not a utopian philosopher, a philosopher who is always and has been and will continue to be a historical subject, a person in a place. There's no persons outside of a place, so a person in a place. So you're doing your philosophy in a situation, in a context, according to a horizon. Now, focus your attention in the rectangle in the center of this drawing that has the three boxes in there, PSPD and TO. Let's just talk about that for a second. If you think about the outer rectangle of that, that's including those three squares, what he's referring to there is philosophy as it's practiced. For the most part, academic philosophy, but generally just philosophy as it's practiced. What does it take? It takes a philosophical subject, someone who's attempting critical thinking, and they don't do that in a vacuum. They do that according to a kind of a standard philosophical discourse, a PD. It's the way philosophers talk, the books they read, the philosophers they think about, the questions that they ask, the questions that they ignore, right? According to a kind of thematic object. What's the point? What are they after? What are they investigating? And according to Dussel, it always ought to be historical reality, real reality as it's been configured and shaped. So here we are, we're philosophical thinkers, we're talking a certain way, and we're working according to, if you look in the upper right, the AA, the academic apparatus, what A. Korea refers to as, the praxis of research, teaching, and social projection or publishing. That shapes how we do our business, what we talk about, our philosophical discourse, what questions we ask, how we write, how we produce, and what it is that we're working on, the thematic object. So all of our work as philosophers is shaped in here according to that, first of all, academic apparatus, but also according to what he calls ideological formation, which plays a role in shaping that academic praxis, the PSPDTO that we happen to be involved in right now. The ideological formation of the society in which we live, and if you're a materialist like a Marx or a Korea Dussel in the relevant sense, you know that ideological formation is formed by the concrete material relations that structure our society, our economics. How we handle our raw materials, our production, and our distribution. And this is part of the superstructure, the ideology that tends to serve as a legitimator and reinforcer of those practices. It's also a function of the practical interests of all involved. And again, as philosophers, as philosophical subjects, we don't stop being historical subjects, which means we don't stop having the kinds of appetites and desires for other kinds of things that we want in life. And we have to figure out how philosophy will fit into those interests. And also what he calls the dominant discourse of society, or the hegemonic apparatus of society. Again, all of the way the larger society is put together and operates, probably for the benefit of some, not for the benefit of the majority, will shape ideological formation. It will shape what our practical interests are. It will shape even the way academics works, even what it's for, even what the university is for, which is where this academic work is going on. So that is what this graphic is meant to convey to you, is that to be a philosopher of liberation is to recognize the context in which we're trying to work as critical thinkers, as philosophical subjects. It's to recognize how philosophical discourse gets shaped. It's to recognize what is allowed to count as the thematic object of philosophy, what it's all about. What it ought to be about is historical reality, but what is it all about? Not always that. It shapes the academic apparatus. All of that serves as what we've learned as the word critique, right? It shows the conditions of possibility of us doing our critical thinking and the limitations put upon that activity. What makes it possible and what shapes it, configures it in one way rather than another. Remember my ongoing metaphor of the deck of cards. Right? The rules of the game make a game possible in the first place. If you didn't have rules, you'd have no game. But once you have the rules, you're playing this game, but not that game. And what the cards count as, how much they matter, whether they're good or bad, depends on the structure, the rules of the game. But the structure could have been otherwise, which would mean the cards could be worth something different in a different game. Same thing goes on with our praxis, even as philosophers, as critical thinkers. We learned that Eocharia said something that seemed like a paradox or maybe even a contradiction when he said that philosophy is autonomous. Remember when he said, look, you can't just have like Christian philosophies. It doesn't really make any sense. If by that you mean Christian ideas direct what questions you ask as a philosopher and what answers you're allowed to have as a philosopher. He says that's not real philosophy. Same thing with Marxist philosophy. It's not real philosophy. When you've already decided what questions count in advance and you already decided what answers are going to matter in advance, you're not really doing philosophy. It's autonomous. It's its own thing. He says, but on the other hand, it doesn't make it immune from self-criticism, from looking itself in the mirror from time to time and saying, look, how is my autonomous activity as a critical philosopher, how is it actually being shaped by historical circumstances, by concrete reality? How is it being shaped? It's being aware of that and being self-critical in that way. And I think Dussel's rather elaborate graphic here is meant to remind us that we are always implicated in that which we are investigating. We can't stand all the way outside of the subject of our philosophical reflections because the subject is reality and you can't step all the way out of that. In a way, right, the relative absolute, we can at least take a critical distance, a critical stance, but you can't get all the way outside. You're always enmeshed in a set of possibilities. You're working out of a tradition, that's unavoidable. So I hope that helps to explain what he's trying to drive at here. So if you go back to the graphic I put up for us earlier, trying to talk about the relationship between the ontic and the ontological and the metaphysical, between, on the right-hand side of this graphic, things, beings with labels, names, categories, put into place, categorized. Well, they're put into place in labels and categorized according to Dussel calls ontology, or a big B being, or the world system that does all that structuring, the ideology that lets things show up in a certain way, the phenomenology that determines how things are going to appear and not appear, and so forth. But then anterior to that, Kriya wants to say that there is this what he calls metaphysical proximity of that which is exterior to, or an alterity to, or what Levinas would call the infinity to the totality that we're talking about. So that which escapes, the more, the transcendent in of the totality. And there he thinks is where liberation is possible, when you can become a thoroughgoing critic. Again, not a complainer. A thoroughgoing critic is one who sees the conditions of possibility and the limitations of how we understand reality. And he thinks that's just what philosophy ought to do. And if we do it, it's a liberating, historical, analogical, analectical, practical, poetic intelligence, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, that's at work there. To try to visualize this one more time, another graphic here. We have the center of this circle, the totality, the system, the being, the way the world makes sense to you. What he calls the ontological, which does all the shaping, the phenomenological, which allows all the appearing and prevents some appearing. That center is the world that we know, that we're comfortable with, that makes sense to us, even with all its struggles and battles. At least we know what struggles and battles we think count. And one of the questions a liberation philosopher might ask is, are we fighting the right battles? Or are we being preoccupied with battles that really aren't as important as we are made to think that they are? That we're kept busy fighting battles in the end that don't really make a big difference in our lives. Okay, and then at the periphery, right, every time you draw a circle, there's a boundary, there's an edge, and some is included in the circle and some is excluded from the circle. At that periphery, which also shows up phenomenologically, are the poor and oppressed majority. And we've tried to say how nuanced we ought to be here. The exterior is never fully, totally, completely exterior, because if it were, we wouldn't even be talking about it. We wouldn't even know. We wouldn't be bothered by it. There's nothing to bother us. But what Dussel really means is the exterior is not absolutely outside the totality, absolutely outside the circle, the great total beyond, because it's totally beyond us. It's outside the cave, and we don't live outside the cave. What he means by beyond being is to be beyond labels, to be beyond categorization, to be have as an ideal, not as a genuine possibility, but an ideal of a kind of utopian freedom, not a freedom as constructed by the center. And what makes this noticeable, the few times that it is, how does non-being or the nothings or the invisible become visible? Well, that's what he means by an epiphany. And the greatest epiphany is suffering, needless suffering, evil, grinding poverty, devastation, oppression, repression, needless death. That's where the epiphany is. And he says that, he uses this word analectical, and it refers to the fact that each human person or group is situated beyond the totality, ultimately, in the anterior. It is about the insistence of the impossible, I would say. The possible is what the totality tells you. What counts, what's actual, what's possible, what's valuable. The impossible is that which is, according to the ideology of the totality, not possible. You can't do that. It can't be done. They can't be real. It can't be meaningful. And Dussel would want to say, in a sense, that there's something insistent still about this impossible. The system says or tries to say it's impossible, but it keeps bothering us. Yeah, it's impossible, but it's still. This is, by the way, an analogy to something that the philosopher, radical theologian John Caputo talks about when he uses the phrase, when he talks about God. To keep it short, you could ask Caputo, does God exist? And Caputo would say, no, God insists. That's how he would answer it. He says, if you mean God in the sense of a big being sitting up on a throne somewhere, some extra entity, some extra ontic being, even though it's super supreme, floating around up there, because I don't think so. You know, but what goes on under the name God keeps coming back, keeps insisting to deal with it, cope with it. And that's what Zubiri was getting at when he talks about the theologal essence of human reality, that there's this feature of us that is a grappling with divine reality. It insists, it impels us, it's ultimate. We can't escape it. And the face of that is most clearly seen, I think Dussel would say, I think Kriya would say, maybe Zubiri would say, I don't know, Caputo would say for sure, is in the suffering other. That's where the ideological facade falls down, breaks down, and we see what's really going on, the real reality, the ultimate reality. And liberation philosophy and praxis, because there's no such thing as the purely theoretical liberation philosophy, it's a doing as much as a knowing, allows a chance for epiphany, allows the chance for something to be seen. So it's a matter in a way of doing philosophy from the periphery. Periphery is required to determine the center. It's dialectical. I am who I am as a function of that which I am not, of the negation of the other. That's that philosopher Hegel's idea coming back of the dialectical. There's a sense that politics, there's a view in political philosophy that says that everybody needs an enemy. Because you won't know who you are as a nation if you don't know who the enemy of the nation is. I think that's a question for another day, and an important one and worthy of discussion and debate. But there's a sense that the periphery of society is required somehow. The circle has to be drawn, and something's going to be pushed to the edge to allow us to be whoever, the us of the center, to allow us to be whatever it is that we are. The periphery in that sense then, again, it's a paradox, is both inside and outside the system, just like we are inside and outside the cave, as I suggested back in our discussion of Plato. The prisoner gets out, but not really out, can't really be out. And the other people have not been out, but yet they have their cardboard cutouts, their language, their concepts that mirror the out somehow. So everybody's kind of inside and outside, marginal, peripheral, as such. Determined and configured and exceeding and transcendent. We're determined and configured, but we always break out of it. We don't break totally out of it because we are always configured and determined. That same tension all along. Periphery is the place of real reality. It's the sign of exteriority. It's a disideologized reality, as both Kriya and Dussel would say at this point. And as relative absolutes, we ourselves are essentially peripheral, marginal beings. That's what we are. We are beings who are never quite. Our being is may being. Our being is possibility. For us, possibility is higher than actuality. It's not what we are, it's what we might be. And a philosophy that forecloses on what we might be is a philosophy that forecloses on who we are. It's anti-human. It's dehumanizing. The configurations of configured configures, that's us, are never absolutely absolute, right? Another world is always possible. And that's what Dussel is talking about, this existential or analectical kind of freedom. That whatever we have, there's always tomorrow. Caputo likes to say the future is always better, not because it is, but because it's future. Right? What we might be is the essence of what we are. Even what you are today, the meaning of what you are today is always TBD. It's always to be determined in the future. What it will have meant for you to be a college student is nothing that you could figure out with absolute certainty right now today. Because you don't know. It never arrives being for us. We're always may being. We're possibilities. So the progressive discovery of the liberation philosopher, to review some of these ideas, what's it like to develop as a liberation philosopher is, well, first we saw this pattern, the naivete of the peripheral peoples who think for instance, the heavenly bodies are gods. Oh, how naive they are. Regular, Western, modernized, normalized persons laugh at that. Oh, they think, look at those people, those primitives. They think the heavenly bodies are God. No. What's really real is that they're big balls of fire and rock or whatever, and they're spinning around us. We're in the center of everything, and we're standing still, and we're stationary, and everything's going around us. Common sense. Just look. It's obvious how it is. Here comes science. Modern mathematical, quantitative, physical sciences, materialistic science comes along and says, look at those regular folk, watching TV and thinking they know what's going on. They think they know what's true. No, that's naive. They think they're standing still and everything's going around them, but no. The earth is rotating on its axis. It's revolving around the sun. It's an optical illusion. We don't have to be naive anymore. We can rely on science. And by science, again, we mean mathematical, materialistic, quantified science, physical science. And science, as we got this far before, thinks of itself as the end of ideology. That's it. Ideology are ideas that give us a false view of reality, but here comes science, and science will give us the clear, true, pure, unobstructed view of reality. But Dussel wants to say that view itself is ideological and a kind of naivete. There's something naive in the idea that science, prosecuted by using mathematical experimental tools, can answer every important question for human beings. There's something very naive about that. And science says, well, anything we can't talk about that, well, that's just mere opinion. It really doesn't have a lot of value. That's ideology, right? Science also is not pure, is it? No, you could see it on your own college campus, I'm sure. What kind of science gets taught? The kind of science that gets funded. And what kind of science gets funded? The kind of science, for the most part, that can be technologized. And by that, we mean able to be brought to market as products. That's where the goals are. That's what science is trying to find. So it's looking at things through those lenses. And again, not necessarily to object to looking at things through the knowledge, but to object to the idea that that's the only way to look at the world. That's ideological. So when you show the place of science in culture, against the horizon of social practices and institutions and other ideologies, you see that science is also configured, right? It serves some interests rather than others, and it tends to serve the interests of what Dussel calls the center, the dominant discourse or the hegemony. And dialectics that shows that what something is a function of what it's not, that we've talked about many times now, shows you the naivety of what we call scientism, the idea that mathematical physical science answers all questions. But then Dussel goes along and says, but even dialectical thinkers like Hegel and Marx, who think, well, we're going to get this all figured out now. It's all going to come together. And all of these tensions, all of these contradictions, in the end, will ultimately be resolved and will all just be one. He thinks is also naive. He thinks that's also a kind of naivete, because it ignores epiphany. It ignores what has to happen for one to be. One would have to exclude everything that's not one. Right? That's what you have. If you're drawing the circle, there's always a circle. There's always an outside of the circle. It's naive to think that you would ever have otherwise. So the least naive intellectual point of view, Dussel wants to argue, is analectic. He's not saying that it's immune, that's the end of the story, but it's the most self-aware philosophical position that says, even dialectics still retains a kind of ideological connection to another kind of center. Analectics would take its preferential option for the poor and oppressed majority as its starting point. The outside, what gets excluded, where real reality becomes visible. But that's not enough, I mean, as a liberation philosopher, to just sit back and say, oh yeah, now I see what he's saying. I've read Dussel and Eikria now, so I'm good. I've read all the books, and I did well on the exams, and so I'm a liberation philosopher. No, it's got to generate something, a praxis. It's impelling, as Zubir would say. It demands a response. It is a philosophy of responsibility, our ability to respond. But how? How? When you see all this, one response might be to double down and reinforce the status quo, to really dig in your heels and say, yeah, but I'm not going to change anything. Or it could effect revolutionary transformation, but there's no guarantees. With Marxian dialectic or Hegelian dialectic, it was all going to inevitably work out anyway. It was all going to come together. But Dussel is too influenced by the existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, Danish thinker, who strenuously objected to Hegel's dialectic. Said, look, you can come up with a nice philosophical system where everything fits together, but there's no system of existence. There's no system for a being whose being is possibility. There's no system once and for all for a being that doesn't have a once and for all. You can't. But what is that being going to do? Well, you can't say in advance. You can't say it's all going to work out. So that's why Dussel is trying to instill in his readers what he called an ethical conscience, not just the moral conscience of doing what one does in one's society, but that ethical conscience of listening to, being open to and aware of that which has been excluded, an analectical sensibility. And if we take the second option, to look for real transformation, that would lead to a kind of poiesis, and that's that Greek word again for making. It would make a new human being in a new world, just like Eikria says is the goal of philosophy, it's the goal of the university, and it's the goal of Christianity, as Eikria says. That poetic creativity, created co-creators at work. So the thematic object of liberation, as we learned, was historical reality. To get to the point where we could start to wrap this up, with a bunch of questions, in the totality, in the standard way that we prosecute philosophy. They're the ordinary questions of life. Who are we here? Who is other to here? What's nature here? And now we know that those questions will get answers based on a prior question. Well, what is our world system? What is the meaning of being? What is our ontology? What is the shape of our phenomenology that allows things to be and to appear as they do? And then we have, though, the questions that are interior even to those, even to the totality, to the world system. Who is here? Who? Those empirical subjects. Who would we be if we were in proximity? Not the proxemics of the system, but in proximity, close to each other, in love, as Eikria say, that metaphysical spot. Where would we be? Philosophy of liberation attempts to answer those questions in addition to the other ones. The other ones are addressed philosophically, of course, but Eikria is saying the questions that stem from the exteriority, from alterity, from infinity, those questions don't get asked. They don't even tend to show up on the radar. And we have to somehow find a way to hear those questions and try to respond to those questions. Further questions. What is our world system? What is our ontology? What's the shape of our phenomenology? Well, that one, there's an easy answer for Dussel. We can just put that out there and say, look, it's financial capitalism. It's neoliberalism. That's our world system. That's the hegemonic center's ideology of what is and what counts and what matters. He says that's pretty much uncontroversial at this point. That's not the trouble. But it raises these other questions, like, so who are we in that system, ontically or phenomenologically? Who are we? What's a possible answer to that? We are consumers. We are becoming techno-sapiens, attached to our devices at all times. Something like that. Who are we in that system? Who is other in this system? Other to this system, in this system? Again, ontologically, phenomenologically, who do we say doesn't really count? And what's nature according to this system? How do we look at the natural world around us according to that ideology of the center? But then, who are we really? Who are we metaphysically? Who are we in our metaphysical proximity with one another? Who are we? What is the more in all of us, the transcendent in all of us? What is that? Who are we really? Really? Not just according to the worldview, but really. And where and what and who are the disruptions or the epiphanies to our totality? What breaks it open? What got the prisoner to escape from the chains in the cave? What was that? And what praxis should we develop? And how would this affect our university, a liberatory praxis? How would it affect our community? How would it affect our world? How would it affect me? Like me? If I didn't just listen to this stuff and let it go in one ear and out the other, but how would it really affect me? Well, I'll end then with some final words from Dussel himself. He writes in 5941, some advice for the beginner, and I think it's a good advice for the more experienced as well, about using our time wisely. He writes, in the preface of this work, it is stated that this theoretical philosophical framework is directed to the beginner in philosophy of liberation. In effect, its purpose is to be of service to anyone who wants to learn to think according to the progressive stages of philosophy of liberation, the overcoming of naivete in stages that we just talked about. For the beginner, then, I propose a model of the phases of its logical development according to the implicit logic of liberation, of thinking about a theme. The philosopher must be able to think all themes. Philosophy is the study of everything, eventually, actually. He says, nevertheless, in the course of one lifetime, the philosopher will be able to think about only a certain number of themes precisely, deeply, and originally. It can't be all over the map all the time. Because themes are infinite and time is short, it is necessary to know how to use time wisely, to choose the fundamental themes of the epoch we live in. It is necessary to know how to use time wisely, to commit oneself to the struggles of peripheral peoples and oppressed classes. It is necessary to know how to use time wisely in listening to their voices, their proposals, demands, customs, poetry, their successes and failures. It is necessary to know how to use time wisely and to put aside secondary themes, those that are fashionable but superficial and unnecessary, those that have nothing to do with the liberation of the oppressed. And he goes on, to pick our themes. We need to pick our battles. Remember, philosophy is polemos. It's a struggle against ourselves and against the powers that be, Kriya said. Dussel writes, something must be said about the criteria for selecting the themes to be thought about. Criteria for themes that you, with your one life, with the clock ticking and the meter running, that you might devote yourself to. In the first place, the absolute criterion is to think about a real theme, and among real themes, the most essential ones. and among essential themes, the most urgent ones, and among urgent themes, those that are more transcendent, and among the more transcendent themes, those that refer to the peoples who are the most numerous, the most oppressed, the ones on the point of death, a death of hunger, of despair. The philosophy of the center, he continues, gives us a wide gamut of false problems with its diversionary tactics and subtleties. Its philosophers sometimes appear to be the court jesters of the system they entertain, and amazed by their witticisms and games of logical sleight of hand. Many students think that philosophy is that course where there's no right answer and it's all about trees falling in woods and whether they do make sounds and angels dancing on heads of pins. Trolley tracks and do I pull the switch? Games. Diversions. Clever. Witty. But do they matter? Ideological themes must not be treated except to show how and why they are ideological. Phenomenological ontology, a good part of analytic philosophy, which is the major kind of philosophy in most philosophy departments in the US and UK for sure, and certain dogmatic Marxisms are luxuries and fireworks displays. They are not themes of philosophy of liberation. Those aren't the themes. Most, he says, of what goes on in philosophy departments, and philosophy departments are in many ways historically the center of the university, don't have traction. The gears never engage with real life. The rubber never meets the road. And what Dussel says is to be a philosopher is to deal with reality. And the most essential, the most urgent, the most transcendent, important themes. Because there's only so much time and the clock is ticking. He writes in 5943, in our case, the theme to be thought comes from reality, be it the everydayness of the everyday world or demand from exteriority. Reality for philosophy of liberation is always, directly, not indirectly, the praxis of liberation, and all that impedes or promotes it. Inasmuch as what is most real in reality is praxis, the praxis of the philosopher determines the way of stating the problem. If it is interpreted from the ontological exigencies or demands of the system in force, all its thought will be ideological camouflage, a diversion, game. If the problem is defined from the exigencies, the demands of the exteriority, it will be a real, critical problem, fertile with speculative, operative possibilities. The rubber will meet the road, the gears will engage. We would actually be getting somewhere with our philosophical praxis. Now that's the argument of Dussel's philosophy of liberation. A number of other interesting concepts and tools that we, alas, did not have time to talk about, maybe in a future course. But our goal was to understand his perspective, his critique of philosophy, his understanding of the operation of society, of how ideologies develop, and how we are sometimes fooled into thinking that we're no longer naive, that we've really gotten to the truth with a capital T. And every time that happens, Dussel says somebody pays a heavy price. And whether you come to agree with his views or not, they're certainly worthy of consideration and discussion as we've been doing.